Morning, everybody. I'm Nicola Dalby from Safe and Sound at Derby. What we do at Safe and Sound is we work with children and young people up to the age of 18 who have been victims, are currently victims, or are at risk of child sexual exploitation. And you're perhaps thinking, what's the relevance of that to the theme for today? But it's incredibly relevant. Today has a huge amount of resonance for us because trafficking in the wider context forms a significant part of the experiences of some of the children and young people that we work with. So I'm just going to work through something. So I'm sorry, I'm trying to work off the screen and I can't see behind me. So if you could just take a few seconds, I'm going to give you seconds because we each have 10 minutes to talk, so I'm going to rush you. So if you can speed read the first blue paragraph, which is actually the generally recognised international definition of trafficking as recognised within the Palermo Protocol. And I'm sure within an international context and the discussions we have around trafficking and modern slavery, you'll recognise that. But how does that apply to children and young people living in Derbyshire, and how does that apply to child sexual exploitation? So I'm going to ask you to do the same. Can you just read the second paragraph? I'm sorry the people sitting on the sides that might struggle with that as an instruction. My apologies. And hopefully the parallels between the two become apparent, because where we're talking around trafficking in terms of the recruitment, the transportation, the transfer and the harbouring of individuals, and then we're also talking about threat and forms of coercion, we're talking about the transfer of young people, adults as commodities, as profit, and we're talking about control. If you then apply that into the same definition for child sexual exploitation, we're talking about recruitment. So we're talking about the planned targeting and grooming of children and young people across Derbyshire and across the country. We're talking about young people being lured and entrapped into a feeling of safety in terms of the kinds of relationships that they're in, the kind of expectations they might develop. We're then also talking about children and young people being abused, maybe by an individual, and then that transferring on and translating into them being abused on a much wider scale. So we're not talking about small-scale stuff here. We're talking about the worst excesses that you can imagine that an adult may place on a child, that an adult may place on another adult. So if you take a few seconds and think about what you already know about exploitation and about abuse, you know what this is. I don't need to lay it out in front of you. You understand it already. You read about it in the newspapers, you hear about it from your friends, you think about the worst excesses, and that's what we're talking about. And then there's the wider sphere of not only the people that we would class as perpetrators and criminals that are abusing children and people, it's then who they're passing them on to. And then in that kind of transfer, it may be that somebody's receiving cash, it may be their goods in kind, which is a really low-level description of something that's quite serious. It could be drugs, it could be a whole series of things that are factors behind it. It can be something around committed status as well. So I hope you can see that the parallels are incredibly strong, and within Safe and Sound and within the field of child sexual exploitation, we are already using trafficking legislation in partnership with other partners to disrupt and to secure prosecutions. We're also using trafficking legislation and the language around trafficking to protect children and young people, so to use every tool that's available to us to disrupt and to secure prosecutions. But actually the most important thing is, and I think somebody said about, is the victim's voice. You'll hear a lot around statistics. UNICEF quote that 10 children are trafficked every week within the UK. From our practical experience in Derbyshire, actually, when we lift the lid off and look at it, we would say it's probably higher than that when you collate figures nationally. And I think maybe other colleagues here would agree with me to that when you look at trafficking in its widest context. So we're not talking about something that's a theory. We're talking about something that's real, we're talking about something that's here, and we're talking about the targeting grooming and sexual abuse, and that's physical abuse, that's psychological abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse and violence of the most serious kind happening to children and young people across the country and within Derbyshire too. So within that context, I'd like to give you one of the most recent examples that's in the public domain of a prosecution that was successful against a child groomer. So a 24-year-old male from Cheshire targeted a whole series of children and young people across the internet and was brought to court in January 2014. Of the 6 young people that were the prosecutions were progressed against, 2 of those were from Derbyshire, a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old boy. You can read for yourself the convictions that the offender was found guilty of. But again, he lived in Cheshire, he met people, targeted young people on the internet, then moved on from the internet contact onto face-to-face contact, so drove to where the boys lived, picked them up near their home addresses, took them to numerous places, including hotels in Durham and Newcastle. So go back to that definition, the Palermo definition, the recruitment, the transportation, the transfer, the harbouring, by means of threat and coercion, and to achieve consent of somebody and having control over somebody who's vulnerable and young. And that's what I want to keep moving on. Now, child sexual exploitation, as adult exploitation, doesn't just affect young women, it affects boys too, and that's why I wanted to use that particular slide, because it's really important that people think about young men and boys when they're looking around sexual exploitation and seeing what's happening. However, of course, young women are affected too. Okay. They're taken to places that we wouldn't normally want anybody to live in, and maybe if we looked at a photograph of the Atwood individuals, they would have been living in something similar. And I think it's what really key here is the interest is the lock on the door. Derbyshire and the city and the county have a fantastic team that are working in the field of child sexual exploitation and are being relatively successful, but we do know that actually the proportion of children and young people we're reaching is considerably smaller than the number of children and young people that are being affected. So there was a message around working together and sharing information, but there's also something to be grateful for in Derbyshire, that actually we're slightly ahead of the game to some degree, and we work very well together already within the field of child sexual exploitation, but we have a heck of a job to do, and it does actually need all of us to do that. So I'm going to pass you on to Mandy MacDonald, who's the strategic lead for child sexual exploitation in the city, and thank you for your time. And on behalf of the young people, thank you for the next action you take to protect them.